So good evening and welcome. Just a few words from me before we get going. There's a lot that is happening tonight, and I really want to be as brief as possible, but there are lots of little things that I'd like to just mention. First of all, tonight we'll have a chance to have a reception outside in the gallery in a way to celebrate the official formation opening of the exhibition, Living Anatomy. And this is an exhibition that's been going on for quite some time in terms of its preparation. It falls under the rubric of our Drucker projects focusing on housing. And it was a real pleasure for me to actually get the chance to also collaborate with the curatorial team. I want to acknowledge them. Megan Panzano, Daniel Rauschberger, Matt Jin, and Patrick Heron, who were in different ways responsible as members of the curatorial team. Very special thanks also to Dan Borelli, the head of our exhibitions, who collaborated with David Zimmerman Stewart to make the exhibition possible. So we have invited the curatorial team to be here so that afterwards also they can participate in the conversation and discussion with all of you. For those of you who've had a chance to look at the exhibition, you see that the focus of the exhibition is really to try and present some of the best possible thoughts related to the topic of housing today. There is, of course, a certain amount of precedent study, but the focus is really what are the kinds of things that are going on that are important contributions. You see that those thoughts are happening under a certain set of titles to try and establish a certain focus on the particular topics or ways or manners in which the issue of housing has been dealt with. We as a school have a long history of dealing with the topic of housing. Many of you who are new might not know that we actually have a wonderful center here at the GSD in collaboration together with the Kennedy School, which is a center for the study of housing. It's the nation's, America's really foremost center for the study of housing. There have been many, many courses taught by various faculty members and lots of studios. More recently, we've had a whole variety of option studios under the rubric of the Dunlop Visiting Critic, taught by Sergison Bates from London, Chino Zucchi from Italy, Spela Vodicnik from Slovenia, and so on. And these projects continue. There are lots of other ones. There is a very long history of housing. Under the rubric of modernism, obviously housing has been a very, very critical part of architecture. And we have seen, just to give you a very short synopsis, we have seen really a kind of period where there has been a critical reception or reaction to modernist housing, and now we see a different kind of opening up and diversity of approaches towards housing. In the process, as we have been discussing also with the members of our panel tonight and our speakers, there's also a way in which architecture in some way has partly disowned and has been disowned by others in relation to this project of housing, so that the way in which architecture was such a critical part of the modernist project doesn't seem to be such a critical part of the contemporary practice of architecture. Why is that? Still, we've tried to, of course, pull out the best practices, but part of our intention tonight in discussion with you is really to find out what is the next? What is the next thing in terms of housing? Where should it go? Why is housing so critical? And what are the topics and issues that we need to focus on in order to regain, in a way, a different kind of perspective, a different kind of position for architecture, design, planning, landscape in relation to the discussion of housing, which is always part of a bigger discussion of urbanization. I also want to show you this beautiful booklet that has been produced by the members of the exhibition. It's made up of two pamphlets, and I ask you to, if you wish, to take some of these, which are away there on the donut outside, and you'll see it when we go out into the gallery. Tonight we're going to hear 4 brief presentations here from our speakers, and the first speaker will be Nicholas Mack. Nicholas Mack has been teaching for us, in fact, last semester in Berlin. He's an expert on housing, specifically mass housing, and he is the art and architecture editor of the German newspaper Frankfurter Allgemeine Zeitung. And we also hope that Nicholas will be teaching a seminar for us in Rotterdam in the spring as part of the Rem Koolhaas's option studio that will be offered in the spring semester in Rotterdam. Nicholas has written many publications, many books, and did a PhD which focused on the work of Le Corbusier and Paul Valéry. The second speaker will be Hilda Heinen, and Hilda is actually spending a part of this semester here with us. She's a professor of architectural theory at the University of Louvain in Belgium, and her work focuses on issues of modernity, modernism, and gender in architecture. She wrote a beautiful book published by MIT Press called Architecture and Modernity, which was published in 1999, in which she investigated the relationship between architecture, modernity, and dwelling, arguing that critical theories such as those of Walter Benjamin and Theodor Adorno offer crucial insights when revisiting the modern movement. More recently, she's written on issues of gender. She is also been working on other publications, some of which I think will be forthcoming. I know she spent time here also at Harvard working at Radcliffe as a visiting professor. Then we'll hear from Irene Skalber. Irene Skalber is an architect and a critic who is based in London, but also teaching in Ireland and in Italy. I was lucky enough to be able to collaborate on a variety of different things with Irene. One project involved an exhibition and eventually a publication that Irene authored on the work of the French architect Jean Renaudy. And that is a very interesting architect who focused on housing. So Irene has also taught for us here at the GSD, so I'm very happy that he's back here with us. Lastly, we'll hear from Eric Bunge. And Eric is not a stranger to the GSD. He studied here with his partner, Mimi Huang. They have an office in New York, which is their practice is called N Architects. He teaches at Columbia and has been involved in a variety of projects, regular visitor to the GSD. Eric is here to talk specifically on their practices involvement with micro units. Recently, as you know, there's been a lot of emphasis on trying to build smaller and smaller dwelling units, a kind of return to the idea of minimum existence, but in a different way. And so we will also hear from Eric as an architect who's practicing on this topic of housing. So the plan is that each speaker will talk for 10 or so minutes. We will try to be good timekeepers. And so after the first sort of 50 minutes or hour or so, we will then invite them to sit here and engage with you in a discussion before we go to the gallery for a reception. So please welcome Nicholas Mack.
Thank you very much. I'm very happy and honored to be here tonight, and I'm very happy to discover my Berlin crew in the audience. And let me quickly start with a picture which has a lot to do with architecture and housing. This was taken some days ago on the motorway in Hungary. These are 10,000s of people, refugees from the Balkans, from Syria and Africa, walking on the motorway to the Austrian border and then further on to Germany. Germany alone will have to accommodate more than 800,000 asylum seekers per year now, and numbers are rising. And of course, the question is, how do we respond to that task? So far, the only two responses are tent villages and container villages. And as this is not enough anymore, people are even brought into empty houses in dying East German villages, where they have to deal with an almost hostile population of people who are still in these little villages. So this creates a lot of tension and problems in Germany now. At the same time, it's clear that many of these refugees will stay longer in Germany. So there is an interesting tendency that proposals that were developed for a more hedonistic context, like the transformation of multi-story car parks, are repurposed now as emergency shelters. You see a proposal by Augustin and Ernst, a Berlin-based office, that proposed this 2 years ago as a form of urban dwelling for less affluent young families and singles. And now this model is repurposed as a model to, of course, reduced in terms of the quality of apartments and materials used. It's repurposed now as a shelter for refugees. So these parking lots in Berlin, multi-story car parks, will be transformed to accommodate refugees. I think it's important when we talk about the very large field of housing that one does not confuse the two crises of housing we're actually facing. In one case, it's about mere survival. In the other, about what society we want to live in and what this society prioritizes and how it defines privacy and publicness in general, and what new spaces for this could look like. But then again, I think these distinct problem areas have a lot in common, including the lack of ideas for fundamentally new, inexpensive dwellings that could conform to changed social conditions, or, and this is also important, I think, encourage such change. And I think when we talk about housing and units, that the discourse on housing, at least in Europe, suffers largely from the imposition of the terms that we use to describe the situation. This starts with the notion of the unit. State-funded programs in Germany and France mostly focus on providing as much units as possible for young families or singles. But of course, a unit is not a natural given. And even before the asylum crisis, there was not much discussion beyond the academic field about how our idea of a unit or of privacy or of the public space is affected by the shifts in social rituals, by demographic change, and by the dissolution of the nuclear family. Because, and I think it's also important for this discussion here, in most European cities, families are not the majority of population anymore. In Berlin and Munich, inner city quarters, not in the outskirts, but in the inner city quarters, families are now almost a marginal group. Their share of all households is between 15% and 20% only, which is not reflected in housing policies. And we do not hardly know a setting that would accommodate a group of, say, 80-year-olds who do not want to move into a retiree home, nor any apartment type designed to house, say, two single mothers, their children, and a gay couple, though this is sometimes wished by the people. So the question what a unit could be and how it could be produced is important already in this setting, but it's also a pressing one given the fact that, according to an analysis of the UNESCO, in Africa, Asia, and India alone, 1 billion new apartments would be needed over the next 25 years to house migrants who move to urban agglomerations. 1 billion new apartments. And of course, the question is, how will these units look like, as it's plain clear that it's ecologically and economically impossible to build these apartments in the way we do it today. So, of course, there were models, and I have not much time, so I'm jumping through these models. There were models who researched possibilities. This is the Nomad Home by Toyo Ito. A more recent one is Leo Lubin's micro apartment that investigates pressing questions of minimal dwelling, of privacy and basic protection, a proposal that relates to metabolist structures, could be stapled. In Germany, the O2 Village is a comparable effort to staple micro units and create social spaces in between. We could discuss this later. I'm jumping through the whole history of experimental housing. We can come back to this later. One thing is playing clear that this model, this is the former president of Germany, Christian Wulff, who had to step down because rumors came up concerning the illegal financial aid he took from entrepreneurs to finance his own dream of the nuclear family dream home. So this kind of killed his career and was seen as kind of a symbolic incident that even the president cannot afford this form of dwelling anymore. So what are alternatives in Berlin? We have interesting, this again, we don't have time for this. The campaign, that's the campaign, 19th century campaign for the nuclear family home, like here depicted as a nuclear family cave, as if this was the normal way to dwell since Stone Age. But we don't have time for that. So I would focus rather on countermodels, the joint building ventures or Baugruppen in Germany, which are interesting because A, they point a way for bottom-up strategies to change urban districts, and important point also, they point the way to self-empower people, to be less dependent from state-funded projects or private developers. So this is really kind of a bottom-up movement where people say, let's put our money together, ask an architect, find some land, a lot in the city, and build a house the way we want to dwell. These new collective housing forms do not exclude families, but they put a focus on other life designs and foster a new idea of social community life. This is R50 by Feser, Heide, and von Beckerath. They have in the basement here a two-story common room that can be used for meetings of the community, and then, as you can see, each floor has a wraparound collective balcony that allows occupants to pass by all spaces, so clearly a focus on the communal. The Berlin Abroad Studio students might remember this building by Arno Brandlhuber. It's a building erected on the ruin of an investor's project, which combines workspaces and living spaces. The Berlin Studio Abroad took place there, so this is an example for kind of also a form of communal living merged into a workspace, a gallery space. Quite an interesting project. And this is another example for joint building ventures by Fatcold Bar and Caponeda Architects. Three houses where spaces are shared. You have a restaurant-sized living room, which is also, as you can see here, used for political gatherings, micro-communal events. It can also be used for parties and used as a restaurant-sized living room. You have these so-called option rooms in the basement. This one is used by a carpenter. Others are used by temporary micro-offices or are used as kindergartens. They're quite open in their definition, but which is interesting to see here, other than in some projects from the 70s, it works quite well also because many people are actually working in these buildings and not only sleeping over. A person who owns a 540 square foot apartment here can use 1,600 square feet of common space, including a roof terrace and these ateliers. So you can argue that here the key to affordable housing and an alternate form of housing is a prefabrication. As you can see, these elements here are prefabricated. It's timber frames and also the externalization of many functions. And in this case, also a state-funded program for energy-saving construction helped finance the whole project. it has a clear focus on like communal spaces. You can see it. This is communal kitchen. This is a kind of communal living room, a communal terrace. This is also collective space, but at the same time, everybody has a toilet and a little kitchenette. So it avoids that you are forced into a community all the time. The architects were really influenced, and I just can show some pictures here, by contemporary Japanese projects. This is On Design's office, Yokohama Apartments, maybe the only project that I would miss in this fantastic exhibition that you've mounted here, because it also relates to questions that you're raising with the exhibition. It has a transitional hybrid space on the ground floor that can be separated from the streets only by curtains. So it's either a public roofed over square with a kitchen in the center, or a more intimate living room with a kitchen when the curtains are mounted. So like the classic Engawa, the space allows both dissolution of the living room into public space or its protection from it. And it's, I think, an important example for a strategy of radicalizing spatial atmospheres. The kitchen becomes a cafe-like space of encounter for, say, a radically extended family, including the neighborhood, and the dwelling cells become even more intimate and cozy. This is another example from Berlin for a new form of communal housing, Kurfürstenstraße by June 14, Sam Shemaev and Johanna Meyer-Grobrücke. It provides space for 23 housing units, but they're not units anymore. They're kind of different things. They interlock across multiple levels, and the occupants have the option to either completely isolate themselves or to merge spaces such as kitchens and living rooms together, opening the way for extended post-familiar settings or circles of friends living together. This again has kind of a counterpart in Japanese architecture, Riken Yamamoto's community area model. Same approach where open structures can incorporate patchworks of workspaces, offices, daycare centers, restaurant-like community kitchens, and, which is also important, studio apartments can be attached like modules when children or older people are added, or when several people want to form a commune. Of course, this I don't have to mention. It's clearly a reference for all these projects, Moriyama House. But as we have not so much time, I would come to an end of this really very quick presentation by addressing one question, which is the question of privacy. All these new forms of communal dwelling and public living rooms also raise questions concerning our idea of privacy, and these questions are addressed mainly in sociology and philosophy. For example, the philosopher Raymond Geuss criticizes the modern conception of privacy that informs our idea of housing, where the individual self-evidently comes first as the autonomous starting point for theorizing and valuation, and community has in a way to find its role in promoting and defending the security and the well-being of the individual. And Geuss questions this view with reference to the ideal of a society that commits its members, to say it in a nutshell, beyond the right to retreat to a form of hospitality and generosity. And this approach fundamentally also challenges the view on housing of these philosophers. So the question here is, how does a house relate to the public realm? Is it hospitable? Does it foster community, or does it include or exclude? And I think one of the most striking examples for exclusive urbanism and exclusive housing in the double sense of the word is Bond Street 40 in New York by Herzog de Meuron, where a graffiti-style fence shields the basement from being sprayed. So in a way, this fence achieves in a cynical way both. It advertises the flair of subculture, while at the same time it's the best protection against the real resentment of the culture it references. So I think this will be part of the architectural history of cynical urbanism. And when we look for examples for a more inclusive way of building houses and of housing, of course, you find that in the exhibition. It's Michael Marzan's Star Apartments, where you do not create a distancing form, but rather a porous, permeable zone where public life can spill into the house. Same was true, I'm jumping again. For this project, the colony, which was kind of an experimental model, how you could create a porous, permeable zone also under precarious circumstances after Superstorm Katrina and other events. So maybe we can come back to this later. That was also part of the colony, where you have this kind of permeable, inviting zone where like the city can be part of the building, and where the like nuclear cells where you withdraw are on the first level. So I think I have my 10 minutes, I'm afraid. And thank you so much, and I'm happy to discuss it in detail later. Thanks.
Well, good evening to you all. I was asked to provide a little bit of historical background to this whole discussion. So chronologically, I'm going back to the beginning of the 20th century, or at least to the 20s. And I thought I should make really 3 points that I want to get across. I do not address gender here. That's also an issue that we should talk about in relation to housing. But I thought these ones were more urgent. The first one is that housing really was at the core of the project of modernist architecture, of the modernist project. The second point is that that really was a story of success, even though it nowadays is often, or it in the 70s, 80s, 90s, it used to be framed as failure. I think it's a success story rather. And thirdly, which is, I think, what is at stake in an event and an exhibition like the ones we are witnessing here, that there is a need to reclaim housing as a core concern for architecture. Let me start with that first. Housing at the core of modernist architecture. It's not always framed like that. But I do think if you look at the history of modern architecture with an open eye, and you see, for example, you put central, what I tend to do, efforts such as those of Das Neue Frankfurt, then you cannot but say, yes, this was extremely important for modernist architects. Frankfurt, Das Neue Frankfurt, it still is, I think, an amazing accomplishment. In 5 years' time, building 15,000 housing units, back then it was still units, 15,000 new housing units, which meant that 1 out of every 11 inhabitants of Frankfurt could move into a new house. That's really amazing. I don't know of any other city that came near to that kind of performance in terms of social and public housing, or even in terms of housing without the social aspect involved. So that really was an important event, an important accomplishment, and it was the main work was done in the field of housing, but housing was seen as part of a much larger endeavor. It was the idea to establish a new modern metropolitan culture that encompassed not just housing, but also sports and other kinds of the visual arts, about education, about affordable housing. Das Neue Frankfurt, the journal, has had team issues about many different topics, the interior. So it really was housing as as a way to organize living. And that's, I think, also how we want to talk about housing today. Of course, you can argue that some of the models that were then presented by now might not be so ideal anymore. We have come to criticize the assumption that the suburban neighborhood, the suburban estate would really be the answer to housing needs. But nevertheless, the Römerstadt estate that Ernst May and his team designed in Frankfurt remains a fantastic example, not just of housing, but also of housing integrated with other amenities like schools and shops and so on, were part of that whole thing. But you saw also in Frankfurt that gradually there was a kind of loss of, let's say, aesthetic sensitivity or aesthetic standards. Westhausen is much more efficient, much more according to existence minimum standards, much cheaper, much affordable because of that. So that was really the neighborhood where the workers could, the blue-collar workers could afford to live, not in Römerstadt. But already part of that whole rationalization campaign that also boiled down to as much as possible for the least possible money. But existence minimum was at the core of the investigations, of the research, really. I think what we hear nowadays about these micro-apartments is indeed taking on that issue again. How to organize living on a minimal space, how to make sure that people do have all the necessary amenities. And back then in the 20s, it was social housing with built-in kitchens, built-in bathrooms. That was amazing for the time that this was provided. So it was an enormous step ahead in terms of living standards. But it was done by minimizing the amount of space, and Ernst May really has an article where he says, what shall we do? If we have a certain budget, we choose really to build as many units as possible for that particular budget, rather than provide people with larger houses, but then have less people that we can accommodate. So it was a very, very rational choice that was made. And the option was to go for the minimum amount of space, but very cleverly designed, like the Frankfurt kitchen by Grete Schulte-Luchotsky, which really was providing everything in a very small space, very functional, but very well designed. I think the micro-apartments of today will also be reminiscent of this type of existence minimum, where you had also research into furniture that could change a room from being a living room during the day to being a bedroom at night. That kind of things was part of the whole experiment of Das Neue Frankfurt. And Das Neue Frankfurt also hosted the second SIAM conference in 1929, which was focused on the existence minimum. The dwelling for the existence minimum was housed there. And that's why I think also if you look at the themes of SIAM throughout its existence of 30-something years, SIAM, arguably the most important organization of the modern movement in architecture, SIAM was very much focusing on housing. The first content-related conference, SIAM2 in Frankfurt, the minimum dwelling, but also the next one in Brussels about rational lot development. That was really how do you organize that housing. The functional city, that was about zoning, and housing was one of the 4 functions that had to be zoned. Dwelling and recreation, again, about housing and how housing relates to other functions. 6, 7, 8, maybe less about housing, but SIAM 9 again says habitat. We want to make a charter of habitat. So again, it became a very, very, very pregnant and urgent issue in 1953. So for that reason, I say really housing was at the core of the modernist project. And I do also believe that in many ways it has been a success story. It's true that many of the projects were criticized and now are problematic zones in, for example, France, to a lesser extent maybe in the UK and elsewhere. It's true. But one should not forget the European welfare state, and to some extent also the American welfare state, in as far as that existed, did succeed in banning shantytowns. Shantytowns were bidonvilles were part of the Parisian urban landscape, for example, until the 70s. It's thanks to all these modernist housing projects that they were banned, that they were abolished. So that is a kind of achievement that nowadays in all these new megacities is not always easy to accomplish. If we heard Nicholas talk about how many housing units cities in the developing world need the coming decades, well, they have been needing such housing units the decades that are just behind us, but they were mostly provided through squatter settlements. So in that sense, really the modernist housing projects did something. By now, we also now know a little bit better how the story of Pruitt-Igoe, how to explain that. The postmodernist discourse tended to blame the design and say, look how badly designed it is, and that's why it failed, and that's why it had to be demolished. No, we understand now that it was a huge mistake in terms of planning, that too many housing units were built for a housing demand that was really dwindling. And of course, if you have a large estate with a lot of housing units and there is no demand and there are not enough people who are willing to pay the rent for these dwellings, then of course you cannot maintain it. Then of course you have problems, and then of course the ones that are still there tend to leave because the elevator break down, etc. So there was a whole process of decay going on that really had to do more with economics and management and cultural issues rather than with the design itself. So I really don't like to hear about the failure of the modernist project like it's so often disframed. And I do think, I'm not sure that this book is out there. If it isn't, it should be there. Florian Urban has published this history of global mass housing, which contains a comparison of these modernist housing slabs and towers in Chicago, Paris, Berlin, Brasilia, Moscow, Shanghai, and Mumbai, arguing that really the histories are very different in all these different places, depending on the local contexts, the social issues, the economic issues of affordability, and of whether or not there are alternatives available, etc. So it's too easy to say it didn't work, we need to invent something else. My last point about reclaiming housing as a core concern of architecture. I think this is really what this event and this exhibition is also about. And I think we have been mistaken in architecture by letting that thing go, letting housing go, disowning the issue of housing, and let it be the domain of other disciplines. I think that process started, disowning housing as a core issue, started in the 30s when modern architecture was received here in the States. If I look at these two books that you are familiar with, or at least the International Style you probably know, you should also know the other book, Modern Housing by Catherine Bauer. The International Style, of course, has come to be the most dominant book in terms of the framing and the reception of modern architecture as seen here in North America. Nevertheless, if I look at these two books, I say Catherine Bauer knew much better what she was talking about than Philip Johnson. Her book, however, came out 2 years after Johnson, and she never made it into a very prominent voice on the scene of architecture. In the 60s, she was invited to a symposium in Columbia where they were talking about decades of modern architecture and about the decade in which her book appeared. But her book was listed as, in the bibliography that was provided for that event, as being not about architecture, but about planning. So she was, on the one hand, acknowledged as being an expert, but on the other hand, she was pushed towards the side of sociologists and planners, and not really seen as part of the core discussion that architects were conducting. So that kind of operation has been going on, and you can point to many more instances of that housing was kind of pushed out of the discourse of architects. And that's indeed why it was mentioned already. If you now look for if you're an architect and you work on housing and you want to publish in an international journal, well, the international journals of housing are about housing policy, are about housing and the built environment, about housing markets, about and this kind of thing. So real estate, sociology, and planning are now dominating the question of housing. And for architects, there is only in this type of publications. Architects only play a minor role. So again, that's why I do think, and I'm very glad to be part of this event here and to have seen and witnessed the exhibition. I think that's why it's really important that a school like GSD claims ownership of this issue, brings it back into the heart of the discussions, because I do think that architecture is about the organization of everyday life for many, many people, not just for the happy few. So that's what I really wanted to stress today. Thank you.
Okay.
Is that working?
Yeah, I think this is working. You can hear me? Yes? No? So I need this one. I thought it was one or the other. Yeah? Now, there clearly has always been housing, and there has almost always been housing designed by architects. But it is only, I think, in the 20th century that we find housing designed by leading architects and by architects who become known for the design of housing. And these architects were modern, and the history of housing design broadly overlaps with the history of modernism. And this primacy attributed to housing by modernists is evident in the Charter of Athens and the four so-called functions. And the first function is dwelling, followed by recreation, work, and transportation. And I believe that the order is highly significant. And here I think I join the presentation of Hilda. Now, what we mean by modernism, I think, has been unfortunately confused, and historians have emphasized its association with industry and with mechanization and with mass production. But the essence of modernism, in my view, was a search not for industrial standards, but for actually living standards. And this is clearly represented by the Unité d'Habitation in Marseille, and at once the high point of modernism, and also, I think, the most influential design in the history of housing, full stop. Now, the apartment of the Unité became the standard by which other housing projects were evaluated, and I believe for good reasons. One thinks of the duplex arrangement, the double orientation, the terrace or balconies, the spaciousness, the privacy, and many other things one could mention. But in the mid-19... I'm trying to move forward. No, wrong button. But in the mid-1970s, even the most celebrated architects appeared to be out of their depths where it concerned housing. In spite of Aldo Rossi's interest in typologies, and you see the Galleratese project here, the apartment of the Galleratese building seemed impoverished and regressive. And those designed by James Stirling at Runcorn fared little better, and actually poignantly, they have actually been demolished 15 years after they were completed. Now, the idealism and the desire to follow through the design of the actual dwellings, I believe, had gone. And the interest shifted instead to the space around the home and the form of urban space. Now, since then, the contribution by architects to the field of housing have been, in my view, negligible. The singular exception is in response to the growing individualism and the corresponding demand for diversity in the housing offer. The most extreme example in this respect is the work of Jean Renaudy here in the screen, and here you see the plan corresponding to that project. And in it, no dwelling and no space in the dwelling is the same. Nevertheless, Renaudy upheld, and I think that is important, the principle set out by Le Corbusier, namely multiple orientation, duplex, spaciousness, and the provision of a garden or a terrace. Another figure also played a role, Hermann Hesberger, though he built little housing, had a contribution which was, I think, significant, and he proposed, as you probably know, a generic form which he compared to a musical instrument, one that could be played upon by inhabitants. Last, there was, of course, the advocacy of participation, always, I think, a marginal option, and that's something which might be worth bearing in mind, and for which Lucien Krull was an eloquent spokesman. Now, these three examples I have just mentioned, I think, represent three themes, you could say, respectively, difference, appropriation, and participation. And they have been revisited 20 years later in the 1990s in Holland, but the context has changed. Developers, now not the states, were the providers, and the social motivation too had changed. The drive for greater individuality, which in the 1970s had been a legacy from youth culture, became in the 1990s a spontaneous expression of the market. Now, at Borneo Sporenburg in Amsterdam, for instance, within a generic type developed by West 8, a family could, in theory, buy or rent a unique architect-designed house corresponding to their needs. And at Silodam by NVRDV, a theoretically infinite number of apartment types were offered to satisfy a theoretically infinite housing demand. Now, in a privatized housing industry, the offer necessarily precedes demand, and the design of dwellings is, I think, in the fundamental way, arbitrary. But then, how could it be at all evaluated, you might ask? Now, in hindsight, it is hard to escape the sense, especially when compared with the best achievements of modernism, that this design that lacked substance and commitment. Too much difference, I think, was spread too thinly, and a comparison between the so-called unité type at Silodam with the real unité in Marseille and elsewhere would, I think, be enough to make the point. Now, the recession in Holland, then the crisis of 2008, derailed this train of thought. The issue became how to reconnect the design of housing with residents, or in the language of the 1970s, with the users. And what one, I think, is witnessing at the moment, in Europe at least, is a resocialization and a repoliticization of housing. Here I'm talking about, of course, what is happening in the architecture world. Now, for the sake of this discussion, three trends can be identified today. The first concerns the rehabilitation of the modern housing stock. As such, it is literally an extension and a deepening of modernism. And the best example I know is a project by a London-based office, the office of Adam Kahn Architect, for the upgrade of this estate, the Yellowbow Estate in Copenhagen. And it consists in the replacement of the existing facades and in careful modifications of the floor plans, and here a simulation of before and after, and in the addition of an extra floor of dwellings with terraces towards the top of the building, and in the provision of a so-called garden room offering a collective focus to the project. Now, the approach is socially and spatially sensitive, and the details, which are partly inspired by the architecture of Peter Markley, I think are unusually fine, certainly for this kind of commission. The second trend, which is actually shown in the exhibition, is more radical in its politics, and it draws from the cooperative movement, which is currently enjoying a revival in Europe. And this project entails a renewal of terrace houses in Toxteth, an impoverished district of Liverpool. And here is the proposal, also in the exhibition. And the architects called, Moyson mentioned them, but called Assemble, an architects collective based in London, are involved not only in the design, they are also actively participating with future tenants in making the project happen and in actually building it. The ones in yellow are architects, but perhaps we could have guessed that. Now, in this, the project, I think, recalls the squatter movement of the 1970s, but in the upholding of radical principles and in the insistence on the purity of the process, the approach of the architects recalls, I think, the Occupy movement. And unusually, in projects of this kind, the care in the design and in the craft of building is very high. Something which I think is very unusual and very promising. This project, incidentally, is underway. I mean, indeed, these last two projects are underway. The third trend places less demands on consultation and participation, and it may have, for this reason, a wider influence, I think, in the long term. It aims to establish a universal type, or at least types that would have a wide appeal. And in Amsterdam West, the office called Atelier Campe Til designed a terrace of identical dwellings in which individuality is deliberately limited in order to achieve higher standards in design and construction. And inscribed in a long tradition of rationalism, the approach draws equally from the classical tradition and from modernism, leading to what the architects call classicism for the IKEA generation. And here is one. Oops, there has been a mixed up here of the slides. Can I move this? Let me see if I can. Well, no, two have gone missing, I'm afraid. You'll have to trust me that I'm telling the truth. So to this, okay, all three trends which I have shown, I think, bear the marks of modernism. And I cannot actually help feeling that the issue today is less what makes people, that is the issue for architects building housing, is less what makes people different than what people have in common and what they actually decide to share. And for instance, the so-called garden room in Copenhagen, for instance, a collaborative work in Liverpool, and for instance, the IKEA classicism in Amsterdam West. And so to this extent, at least, in emphasizing what is common rather than what is different, housing after modernism will, in my view, be modern again. And of course, it goes without saying that housing doesn't have to be modern, and in most cases, I believe that it will not be. But in respect to housing design, modernism, I think, is our beginning. That is, in our profession, it is our antiquity. It is ancient Greece and ancient Rome combined, and its influence, I believe, will be felt for decades to come. Thank you.
Good evening. 20 years ago today, I was sitting in this room waiting for my second year to start. Very good to be back again. So why are we talking about housing now? It's a discussion we were just having before this talk. And it seems that there is a kind of confluence of many changes in different frameworks that are making this an exciting time, also a challenging time for architects to insert themselves back into the sort of agency that we need to be claiming. And these probably exist across different frameworks, such as the social framework. We are seeing a great change in demographics, as we heard from Nicolas. Also in the programmatic sort of framework, we are now seeing many changes in how we live and work, and therefore the typologies that we've been trusting for so long are kind of being eroded. In sort of the economic framework, we are now considering different models of ownership, like the Baugruppen that Nicolas has also mentioned, co-housing and so on. And finally, the sort of physical framework, if you want, or the constructive one, is also interesting to consider in terms of new fabrication or construction technologies that might change, again, the way we think about housing. Perhaps it's obvious to state that housing is probably the most constrained of all the endeavors of architects, hemmed as it is between the market forces on the one hand and, of course, the codes on the other. They're very constrained. And so one could say that it's a sort of physicalized, if you will, datascape that reflects the rules and other influences more clearly than other types. So, but however, the clarity of this framework is kind of exciting too, because it's also, possible to be disobedient or cleverly obedient within a framework that is clear. Certainly a little bit less so in the United States, perhaps than in other countries, in New York especially. So, in our work, I think we sort of situate our own housing production, or our work on housing, within several larger questions, which are sort of opportunities to instigate or adapt to changes. We've been interested in how architecture can adapt to climatic changes or demographic and so on. Secondly, thinking about creating different scales of interaction between different publics, or rethinking who the public is. It's not a sort of general idea of public. And finally, as a kind of opportunity to affect a macro scale with minimum of means, and in this case, minimum of micro units, minimum of spatial means. So we've only worked on 4 housing projects so far. We're now working on a 250-unit tower in Hong Kong, but it's still an important part of our practice. And the ones in Hong Kong, by the way, are smaller than the ones in New York. They don't call them micro-units, they just call them apartments. And an article in the South China Morning Post last spring referred to our project, our micro-unit project, as Hong Kong-style apartments arrive in New York. So the irony that we're now working in New York is not lost to us. So in 2012, we were invited by the developers Manhattan Development to join them in a competition for Mayor Bloomberg's Adapt NYC competition to design the first new microunit prototype in New York City. It had to be a developer architect team, so we can talk about agency afterwards. We can't do these things alone can't even enter these competitions alone. My partner Mimi and I were a little bit horrified at first, to be quite frank with you. We've sort of drunk the Kool-Aid a little bit now that we understand the larger context of this issue of micro-housing, but we were a bit horrified about the idea of designing apartments that range from 250 to 350 square feet. I'll explain a little bit later why now we're less horrified. But so in the beginning of the 20th century, Jacob Riis focused his camera on the urban poor and shocking a nation and galvanizing, basically, a nation to revisit some of the laws that would provide proper sewage and proper ventilation to a city of over 3 million. And so the housing reforms that followed over the next decade really encouraged a set of new legal standards for light and air and health and safety. Now, meanwhile, after the Second World War, housing, the average size of a home has practically doubled from about 1,000 square meters, 1,000 square feet in 1940s to its apex in 2007, just before the crash, at about 2,700 square feet. Kind of like large cars from the 70s. They seem now like a little bit like relics of a kind of of time gone by. Because these were tailored to nuclear families, which, as Nicholas has mentioned, is really a minor aspect of our society. In Manhattan, we have 46% of inhabitants are really single, and the single 1 to 2 person household is a very large proportion. It's dark blue is 1 to 2 person households. And you see that if you compare to Boston, for instance, 38%, 33%, and so on, it's a trend across the United States and across the world, even more so in the European capitals and in Tokyo. And this is also something that has been increasing substantially in the last couple of decades, a 30% increase, I believe, in the last decade alone. So what are the options to people in at least New York City, where there's a large number of illegal apartments that are in fact micro-units, by another name, where one might have no view or a really insecure situation or very little space. And so the other option, I guess, is to move out and put an extra burden on our transportation infrastructure and contribute to sprawl. So the Bloomberg administration, in conjunction with the Citizens Housing Planning Council in New York, initiated a study and exhibition called Making Room, in which they created a body of research that was then used as a reference for the competitors in the competition that we subsequently entered. And so that competition basically challenged developer architect teams to come up with a micro-unit type on a very small lot owned by HPD, Housing Preservation and Development, right next to a NYCHA site. And we won this competition by basically following the brief and doing something very straightforward, which I think. The site is on 27th Street in Manhattan. So this is First Avenue and 27th Street on a kind of a dead end, small pedestrian street, and this is our project. So our big challenge, as we saw it, was to design a building that was somehow generic in that it would be a prototype, a replicable prototype. That wouldn't really be a standalone building per se, but that would insert itself within the sort of legacy of housing in New York, for which reason we chose brick, just to give an example. But at the same time, they would express something about micro-living in terms of its dimensions without expressing the individual. So unlike Moshe Safdie's Habitat or other subsequent projects that have tried to equate the idea of the physical unit with the social unit, we were very interested in fact, thinking about how people who live in small apartments need to be nested into different sort of sets of scales, of social scales. For this project to occur, we were granted several mayoral overrides, the most important of which were to lift the minimum number of dwelling units, which is called density in the zoning code, and to lift the minimum area, which in our current code is 400 square feet. The rest were sort of just minor ones to do with our project. So again, we thought of the project or the resident as living in a variety of scales in a nested way, and the very important one is the amount of social space which we are able to contribute in the project, which is not very much, but substantial for maybe this type in New York in any case. And here you see them distributed. It's a very small building. It's comprised of 55 units. It's 9 stories tall. It's built with modular construction. And normally developers won't even let you do these things, but we were able to provide quite a few little amenity spaces, which of course we wish there were more. One other thing that we thought was quite important was, since people are living in very small units, to connect them very clearly to their context by providing very large windows and great ceiling heights. So the typical unit, which is about 300 square feet on average, has a 9'8" ceiling, which allows for overhead storage, and also a very kind of tall sliding glass doors, which lead to, or don't really lead, but reveal a Juliet balcony. We have about 5 to 6 basic types. 7 are shown here, but they're basically similar. This is the most dominant one, which is quite straightforward. It's very difficult in such a small lot to, basically come up with many different orientations and configurations, as it were, that meet the code. And one thing about our code in the United States is that differs from other countries is that the interior of the apartments has to be accessible. Fully accessible to wheelchairs. The one we're designing in Hong Kong does not. Right at the threshold between the corridor and the unit, you can dispense with that and have kitchens that are 600 millimeter space between the counter and the fridge, for instance. So what it results in is a disproportionately large bathroom and kitchen for the size of the apartment, but we've tried to somehow make it efficient. This is the current plan of a typical floor, where you see basically 4 similar apartments facing the south, and then the grain shifts to the west. We have a kind of an efficient core. At the end, this is very small, I grant you, but at the end of every corridor we have a shared storage, a sort of vestige of something, a grander idea we had, which was to have at every end of the corridor a social space, but this was eroded bit by bit, not so much by the developers as by the kind of very tight site and the redundancies of modular construction, which requires kind of a certain thickness of walls. We're on track to finish the project in December. This is a rendering, which people have thought is a real photo, but it's a rendering that we submitted as part of our competition. If you want to make something look real, render it under construction, I guess. It looks a lot less beautiful under construction than this photo because we have all this ugly insulation on it. But just to describe quickly how we built it was kind of interesting. We used traditional construction for the basement and the first floor, and modules produced in the factory in the Brooklyn Navy Yard for everything else, including the core. It's about as high as one can go with this system. I think about 135 feet before one needs to have a braced core, as I understand it. And so basically, they're modules comprised of steel pipes and a chassis like a car, and a redundant floor ceiling assembly. So these are kind of weather tight and they stack on each other. This is an interior of one of the modules under construction. They feel luminous and spacious to me. So this is a typical day in the factory. It's a short video. I'm not sure if I'll show it all. It's maybe 2 minutes. But it shows you how the modules advance along the assembly line, just like in a sort of Model T Ford, with different trades, all unionized, working, kind of doing the same thing over and over again really efficiently, which in principle should really speed up construction and give it a much higher level of finish. One thing we were able to achieve is a high level of tolerance, which was very important in this project. We were building to 3 millimeters, which is 1/8 of an inch, beyond which we would in fact not comply with code. We were in such a small site that if we were to have a slightly smaller width of apartment, it would basically not comply. So this would have been very difficult with traditional construction. So this actually is taking a long time, this building, paradoxically. But what was very fast was the stacking, which happened in 3 weeks and was kind of breathtaking. And I guess one thing that was really nice was that it really had a very low impact on the neighborhood because of very quiet construction. You just hear like welding as these things go into place. Of course, now we're back to sort of traditional construction. As we skin this with brick, we had decided to do that for many reasons, one of which was just in terms of making sure we have a good envelope, seal, and so on. Just quickly, I forgot to put 2 slides here, but 4 points I wanted to make about thinking about units. Niklas broached this topic. The housing studio that I'm teaching this semester is dealing precisely with this issue that we're sort of prisoners of language in that sense, and kind of inheriting kind of a lot of preconceptions about housing, which is a type that has probably the most number of, or the largest baggage, shall we say, which is a great thing too. So what we're trying to do in the studio is consider what is a unitless house or unitless housing, and reconsidering the idea of units in 4 frameworks. The first is the social unit. For whom are we designing if, in fact, 37% of Bronx residents is comprised of single mothers with a child, just to give an example. And co-housing is introducing new types. I think it's, even though we sort of speak about it, we don't really design for something outside of a nuclear family. Most of the types that we see in the exhibition are still adhering to that, with the exception of a few. And perhaps that's just sort of the opportunities we have. The second is the programmatic unit, is why I call it housing if we now work at home, and if we shower in the office, or if we work in a cafe. Is it possible now to think more of amenities rather than program? In fact, take the discussion out of the idea of dwelling per se, but thinking about new connections that adapt to a more contemporary and fluid lifestyle. The third is the sort of economic unit. Somebody owns housing at one point, and you either rent or sublet from the person or the agency or the company that owns the housing. But the Baugruppen that Niklas also has shown, which I'm taking my students to see in 3 weeks, offers an interesting model of sort of bottom-up architect-led initiatives, but also new models of ownership. If in a time where we share cars to go, city bikes or Uber and so on, is there a new model for securing one's right to a dwelling rather than thinking about owning or renting? And then finally, the constructive or physical unit. Even though we don't build with modules or think about modules all the time, I sense also, not just in student work, but in general, that we tend to think of housing as a combinatorial game in which we take preconceived ideas of units, whether it's a 1-bedroom, a 2-bedroom, or a townhouse, and we put them together like Rubik's cubes or puzzles. But what if the units really are plumbing or shared spaces or balconies or some other scale? Is something I'm interested in kind of unpacking. And I think the correlation between these 4 frameworks of units, the social, the programmatic, the economic, and the physical, has led to kind of a standardization of thinking about housing at a time when we can really think about new things. Thank you.
So we're going to go straight to questions, because I think it'd be really interesting to open this up as quickly as possible. I think, in the interest of getting a conversation also going between our presenters, perhaps I could ask you to, those of you who'd like to ask a question, maybe we can collect 2 or 3 questions at a time, and then have our panelists basically address those questions amongst themselves and also in response to your points. So can I just see, there are microphones here. Can I see if anybody has any comments or questions that you would like to make? Otherwise, I'll have to start, and I'd rather you do it. Any thoughts? Please, back there. Wait until you get the mic, please. Thank you.
Hi, so I guess this is specifically for the micro unit as being a really viable option for cities like New York who are facing extreme housing crisis. And it seems like this project was primarily a market rate project, but how do you think that type of construction could be manipulated to start being an option for addressing the affordable housing issue?
Great. Any other comments, please?
Hello. Hi. Thank you for the presentation. I think the common framework in all 4 of your presentation is that there's this point in how the history of housing and in architecture where the main focus of the discussion changes from the notion of hospitality or the quality or the actual domestic condition of the house into more about the discussions of statistics and real estate and how the housing has to adapt to the market. And so I was just wondering, where do you identify that shift from that kind of an architectural discussion of the dwelling to a more almost engineering to or statistic-based discussion of housing and the urban?
Great. Anyone else? Okay, well, maybe we can start with those 2 points. It would be great if you just, not only Eric, but others, maybe if there are comments about that. I know Irene is already ready to go. So,
Well, I
Irene,
could address
do you-
the first question.
Sure.
Just clarification, actually.
Do you have
Is
a mic?
this microphone on? It's supposed to be on. Yeah, now it is, I think. Yes. So, actually, 40% of the units in our project are, in fact, allocated to affordable, and are only can only be acquired through the lottery, depending on one's income. But I think the question of, and probably this building is not a great example because it's sort of a one-off, and one would have to understand a kind of impact of the scale if one were to introduce many of these micro-unit buildings throughout the city. But I think the framework through which one measures kind of these issues, the impact on affordability, has to be various and many different scales. One of which is looking at the broader issue of sprawl and transportation networks and sustainability from sort of that that sort of framework. But I think that what the administration is trying to do is just provide a few more choices so that you don't end up with people sharing illegally. Apparently, it's not legal for more than 3 unrelated adults to live in an apartment in New York City, for instance. Can you imagine? Other than students in dorms. But so there are a lot of things that administration was trying to maybe address in terms of affordability, but it will take years and maybe many examples to really, I think, assess whether it has an impact.
Irene, you were.
Well, it goes without saying that when one design and build housing, the relationship between the actual design with the contingent circumstance does matter inevitably. However, I think in the context of what I understand this exhibition and this discussion, I think that the question is how can one actually place housing at somehow the forefront of at least one of the main concerns among architects in the architecture culture. And I think if this were to happen, my feeling is that architects need to look not only at satisfying what the market may demand or what tenants may demand, but they need to be some steps ahead and consider what actually constitute good housing. And I think, and perhaps Hilda will correct me if I'm wrong, but in the periods which I can think of, which have been exemplary in housing, and in the experiment, which I would regard as exemplary in housing, it has usually entailed a group of architects or an architect to ask that fundamental question: what constitute a good dwelling? What constitute a good apartment? And then it is the responsibility of the architect to actually promote it to whomever is the relevant person to promote it. Le Corbusier was talking about captain of industries, and he was always fighting, like so many architects in the modern movement, fighting to actually make these situations possible. What it strikes me very much at the moment is that architects are quite passive with what one could call not captain of industry, but captains of the economy. They are kind of saying, well, all right, they have the power, we are going to give them what they want. Well, if you want to make housing which is genuinely good I think this is not the right approach, in my view.
Well, I think if, just to come back to what you said, it turns out that one of the main points we're discussing here is the question, how can market interests, which are also playing a role, the micro units, and efforts to preserve the social city can be reconciled. And I think that's also something we're discussing in Berlin a lot, and the students who have been there have done beautiful proposals to solve that question. And in Berlin we have, for example, we have one proposal that is to increase the maximum eaves height, which is currently at 72 feet, to 85, which would allow private investors for the construction of luxurious penthouses, with the condition that the owners in turn have to commit to renting one floor out at 60 euro cents per square foot. And so that was one proposal, to create affordable space at the same time and get this kind of social mixture, which is also desired. And I wondered, coming from this background, when I look at your project, I think you escaped beautifully the economic pressure, which was also on this project. But I saw in the exhibition 2 years ago, where your project was rightly so awarded the best one, that others kind of collapsed, other architects collapsed under the economic pressure to create micro-scale apartments, and then this turns into kind of a hyper-capitalist worsening of the situation, that people are forced to squeeze more apartments into the same shape. So my interest would be, once you're here, to tell us a little bit more about how could you create these like social communal spaces, and why. That's my only question that might be a little be critical with your project. Coming from Berlin with all these communal kitchens and option spaces where you have carpenters doing something with the kids, and you have a gym in the basement, which at first sight looks even as if it would like worsen the situation of the poor New York person who after work has to come home and like exercise in his gym to be fit for the next day. So, and if coming from this hippie-esque Berlin background, you would say, why do you not have a communal kitchen where you invite people from the neighborhood to experience the community?
The gym is in the best spot of the building. Actually, it's not in the basement. It's the ground floor.
Yeah.
The first floor.
So it's even more.
It's very public and
quite questionable to
exercise
rather than
it's true.
hang out and party.
The original idea, in fact, was to have a kind of creative communities center that would have programming with like dance classes and so on. But our partner pulled out. We had a kind of an idea when we went into the competition with the Actors Fund, was the idea that it would have dance performance and so on. That would be half for the residents, but also for the public. Unfortunately, this was removed, and this is a question of the agency. I mean, we had, and we have safeguarded many aspects of the project, and thankfully, it was because we won a competition. I think the developers would have crushed us completely had we not won the competition. We were able to protect some key ideas like the great ceiling heights, like the amount of public space, the having this public, main ground floor rather than retail, for instance, or rather, because it was public. It was made public through the competition process. But no, you're right. I mean, one can criticize the context, and the architect, we're part of that context. But
as I said, I think you escaped
Can I pick in on that? Because I think the question as it was posed was in terms as if architects have to provide quality rather than quantity. And of course, architects have to think about the quality of living, absolutely. But in saying architects' business is quality and not quantity, you kind of avoid to pose the question also in political terms. Housing is a political issue. It's a decision of a society how to provide for housing, how much budget is allocated for housing. Is it just the market forces? And then, of course, there will be no affordable housing for a lot of people. Or is there a correction to the market forces? And then the politics step in, the politicians decide or to allocate a certain budget for making affordable housing. There is a kind of logic to that has everything to do with politics and not with architecture. And so this political context is absolutely crucial. That's why the decision of the mayor to make this exceptional circumstances was very necessary to make this experiment possible. But still, also there, I think we also, I hear also voices that say, well, is this not a very dangerous path to follow with these micro apartments? Because now you say it is meant for single person households, but and they make up the majority of the people living in Manhattan. That's true at this moment, but who says that maybe in a couple of years' time that there will not families or households of more than 1 or 2 people move into these apartments and recreate slum circumstances that we didn't know anymore since the beginning of the 20th century. That kind of questions are also asked, and I think it's right to ask them.
It's true. It's a question of regulation. Actually, it won't be permitted to live in this apartment if you're more than 2 people. And I've asked the question, what happens if you have a child? You know, how much notice do you have? but I did have one opportunity to try to intervene as an architect within the sort of spectrum of politics, which is when I testified to the City Planning Council about the micro units and was asked for sort of my recommendations on what the zoning changes should entail or include, because we are very worried that the city will relax these restrictions on the minimum dwelling size and the density of the apartment without requiring developers to add something back, which we were able to do by because we're trying to say, look, it's the same volume. So in fact, if we can get greater density in terms of height, which is fine in New York, we can get a lot more apartments, and I think that's a very important issue without sacrificing floor area ratio, FAR, without giving that. So that plus more storage. We have 3 levels of storage in the building. There's in the basement, in your units, you have more than in a 3-bedroom apartment, then you have every floor. That's very important for people in a small apartment in our kind of current Amazon Prime economy. and then finally, the social spaces, which are so important. The best spaces were given over to the public, the ground floor, but also the 8th floor, which has the setback, which is the salon for communal kitchen, actually. It's a communal space for eating. So each one is programmed. There's an office space, there's a kind of a library with a pool table. And this is marketing consultants who are all over this and trying to establish exactly what people want. But actually, in a sense, they've done a good job because they've kind of realized there's a spectrum of uses that are typically not provided. This is what we fear will not make it into the zoning code when they make those changes.
I know, Irene, you want to come. I also want to give Daniel, Megan, and Matt, if you have, I wonder, do you want to make some remarks or contribution there? You're nodding your head, so maybe we can give them the mic here, and then we'll go back to Irene and if there are any other thoughts.
Hi. One of the things we were most interested in our work with the exhibition was sort of representing the simultaneity of scale that is inevitable in housing, the search for the kind of living standard, putting the occupant or visitor sort of at a one-to-one scale of living within these spaces, sort of registering some sense of personality, potentially, sort of filling these things. At the same time as registering how a kind of aggregation or the kind of organizational logic might actually produce a form that has a more kind of urban resonance. And I'm wondering, because we are interested in the simultaneity of scale, sort of where you all feel the greatest potency is for architectural design agency in, what's to come for housing. Is it in the kind of mediation between these two scales, the space of seclusion or the space of engagement, perhaps? And I saw that sort of maybe playing out in examples across all presentations. Or are we now in a realm where we're sort of surgically adapting what we're inheriting, sort of where new meets old? So I'm wondering specifically sort of what is the raw material of the design, world in terms of what we can actually manipulate with housing to come? Where do you see the kind of greatest potency, or where does that live?
Irene, do you want to answer that and raise your earlier point, or?
No, I'll just wait for the next question, which also will
Daniel,
be fascinating.
So thank you all, and I think just to continue what Megan was saying, I think this exhibition really stems from an understanding of that what we're dealing with is an inheritance of modernism and the modernist idea of housing. And in a way, what my question would be maybe more towards you, Nicholas. Are we reinventing this wheel, or are we simply redesigning it? And when we see something like the Moriyama House that to an extent works or doesn't work today, what is this? Is this really something new, or are we just redesigning the same thing?
Well, just to answer this question quickly, we're not reinventing the wheel or redesigning it. I think we're hoovering now without wheels, because it's something completely new. The situation is completely new, and I thought you gave a beautiful talk on the so-called failure of modernist proposals, and I think for the first time these modernist proposals could actually work, because for the first time people are working to a large extent at home. And if you go to Spreefeld, which is architecturally not the most advanced project, but it's working beautifully well, because these option rooms are, for the first time in architectural history since the starting of modernity, people are enabled to work at home. So there's kind of a social control over these option spaces. So whereas all these spaces that we find in the Robin Hood Gardens were not used by the people, because most of the people had to work all day long in factories or wherever. They came home, they were tired, they were not using these spaces. Now, in this situation, people are working in these structures, they're working and living there, and this leads to the fact that you don't have these slum-like corners which are undefined and not accepted by the population and by the inhabitants, but for the first time people actually are working in these spaces. And so for the first time, if you repurpose these sometimes old models of the whole house and of early modernist communal spaces, there's a chance that they could actually work, because our working conditions have changed. And the conditions under which we raise children have changed. And this is also a thing that in these new communal structures, larger extended families are able to look after children while others are working. And so I think that demographics, the change of life rituals, might lead to the fact that these models that were already called dysfunctional could finally be the germ for a new form of architecture. And again, I told this to the students in Berlin, I tell this here. I think it's a very exciting moment that we are forced to develop forms to accommodate up to 1 billion people, and I told that before, in Asia, India, and Africa alone, which is not counting in Latin America and America and the industrialized countries of Europe. So this is an apocalyptic number, but it's a fantastic task for architects and planners to work together and to speculate of how these forms could be produced and how they could look like. And again, we see it in East Germany. It's not sufficient to provide units for migrants and for refugees and put them on the edge of little villages, say that's fine, there you are, you have your units, but you have to create social spaces where people could meet each other, in spaces of encounter and of new forms of communal activities that bring together newly arrived refugees, old inhabitants, and so on. So we are forced to develop solutions, and that's a big chance for architects to start now their practice. So I would be very happy if I would be a student and know that I should be part of this committee to find solutions for that. Because I think so. I would be very positive about all these developments. So we are behind the question of the wheel. We're now in the air. This is more about aerospace and aeronautics where you are now. So.
I like very much the kind of optimism that is in the air.
I'm totally optimistic.
But at the same time, I'm not completely at ease with the optimism, in the sense that in the 90s we talked about the end of public space as if the social media and internet and so on kind of diminished the need of people to go out and participate in public space. I think it was a very real issue. It still is a real issue. That there is a kind of, Lieven de Kouter calls this a tendency of capsularization, that people tend to insulate themselves from others by in their bedroom, looking behind their computer, doing a lot of things through Facebook, but not going out and have face-to-face conversations.
I wonder if that's true. I mean,
well,
many of
that's
us are
my
together
question.
alone. It's kind of like the discussion at the end of the 80s about information technology displacing, the need for public space completely. And in fact, it's just superimposed new kinds of media, new uses upon the ones we have. And now libraries are community centers or work, or they're like offices, basically. Libraries.
But my point was, I'm very happy that you all pick up these tendencies and say this is where the future is. But and I absolutely hope it's true. But I'm not sure that maybe we are mistaken a lifestyle that is very much a lifestyle of a particular part of the population, young, urban, still single. That we take this lifestyle to be the lifestyle of the future. Is it not the case that 80% of the people do not live in this way?
So some research...
Even in North America and Europe?
Well, some research by the CHPC, Citizens Housing Planning Council, showed no correlation between family size and age or any other kind of social indicator like income and so on. In fact, you have a lot of elderly people, of course, who are now alone, or a lot of divorced people, apparently. That's a huge new segment of the the single or the one.
And who hate to go to retirement home because they do not want to give up their privacy. So, and retirement homes are an example of micro apartments with a lot of social space around, no? But people hate to go to retirement homes. Yeah, so there is a tension there.
That's a formal take on retiree homes, because retiree homes are basically hospitals where people have to stay for the rest of their lives. And if you look at the redesign of homes for the elderly, it's interesting to see that you come to this kind of communal model again. And that works beautifully. And to come to the second point you mentioned, I'm not sure whether we do not have to differentiate more what's happening with the impact of electronics also in the third world. If you look at Africa, the chances that are given to people who have internet access. This changes not only the industrialized countries, but also it changes Africa to a large extent. And so I think we have to rethink and redefine our definitions of private life, public life, because even in Nigeria or in Kenya, where I was recently, many things that were done on the marketplace in a physical way 20 years before, like selling goods, buying goods, exchanging information, is done via the internet now in Africa, and that helps largely to develop areas and villages. And so I think that we have a superimposition of these two levels, which is very productive. And the only thing that is challenging is that you cannot clearly tell anymore when someone worked for 8 hours in his bedroom on a computer, selling things, buying things, exchanging information. If he leaves his apartment to have a walk in the street, is he going from a private sphere to a public realm, or is he rather doing the opposite? Is he escaping the realm of communication to have a moment of immersion in what we still call public space? So I think the binarity of these oppositions, private and public, inside and outside, it's not working
like that
anymore.
Buñuel movie where the guy goes into a very small cubicle to quickly eat.
So, and I think it lies a chance, and you said this, I think, just to finish that shortly, you said that we're trapped in language, and I think this is a crucial thing. You cannot repeat this often enough, that architects, when they're asked to design a 4-story high building, they think of stacking and aggregating 4 boxes of 3 meters height. And then you have the example of the house NA by Fujimoto here in the exhibition, where he says, no, 4 stories can also mean 20 levels. And I think this is a liberation of thought from the constraints of language, which is very important in that time where we have these changes.
I mean, my feeling that these conversations that housing actually can respond to a very specific circumstance to do with, for instance, disability, for instance, old age, for instance, evolution of households over the years, and so on. This, in my view, is a luxury of certain countries in the West and elsewhere. What strikes me at the moment is that there is an absence of a general theory of housing. There is no, for instance, book, which I'm not saying that this is the one, but I mean there is no book which is equivalent, for instance, to the book which was written presumably here by Sert, Can Our City Survive? And which was an attempt to actually theorize how we might approach the problems in cities and specifically in housing on a very large scale. And I think, in my view, architects have perhaps a responsibility to think about those things. Now, to my mind, this kind of work needs to take place upstream, and after that, at least if one wants to have a genuinely significant impact on the future of housing. And that everything to do with being specific in addressing the offer happens afterwards. I mean, in those instances where architects have had really a significant effect on the development of housing.
We didn't answer Megan's question. We're getting there. I think without actually fundamentally changing the structural things that define housing, its organization, the sort of ideas of the family, the units, we're just chiropractors. We're just kind of moving things around and compositionally changing things. But can we sketch out and imagine, like, just take on the issue of organizational concepts. What organizes housing, right? Orientation, solar orientation, horizontal distribution of circulation, structure, plumbing. If you just take those things, what if we come up with a new idea of plumbing? Or what if we don't use water to evacuate waste? Would it actually liberate cores to become not vertical anymore? Would it liberate kind of the repetition of floor plates? New models of structure. I mean, we can think of a lighter building, more lightweight ways to build buildings and so on. I think there's an optimistic way to go in and look at every sort of structural thing that's defining housing as we know it now. And it can be the social dimension, it can be the idea of the program, and we can just take the physical elements. And I'm optimistic.
Great. Any other thoughts or comments? Maybe you'll have, there are a couple of hands, 3 hands, 4 hands. Can we ask you to make brief? I really want everybody to still be able to go outside and mingle and see the exhibition and have a glass of wine. So please, go ahead.
I actually had a direct question to Hilda. Hilda, you were talking about this concept of isolation that's been, more prominent ever since social media has set in, and the whole use of public space has sort of become obsolete almost. And I guess my question to you is, as a designer, as an architect, would you think of responding to that isolation and in the future designing for spaces that sort of support that kind of living as just as a reality that we're accepting? Or would you think about, as an architect, stressing more on community spaces or more communal spaces where people get to actually go back to that sort of social interaction?
I think I would go for the second option. I think this tendency of individualization is something, an insulation of the individual, is something that is very characteristic of modernity. The fact that we have so many single households is evidence of that. Why do you have single households? Because people can afford to no longer live with their parents, to have a divorce. If the economic situation is very, very bad, you don't have as many divorces. So, because, for a long time, women simply could not afford to leave their husbands. So they didn't, they stayed. And then they were less single families, or single households. So the tendency clearly is in that direction. And as architects, we should not ignore that. But I do believe that it's very important. As people, we have this need to be ourselves, to be our own person. We do desire an amount of individual space. Apparently, many of us want to inhabit our own space without bothering about other people living with us. Apparently, that's what we do. But at the same time, we are, of course, social beings. And I think that's why I found one of the most interesting common issues here that all of us addressed is this need to make interactions possible between the private space and the public realm, and to make intermediary spaces to kind of encourage people to be part of a larger community, and that's where architecture, in terms of organization of spaces, has agency. It makes a difference whether you really make isolated bubbles where people have trouble of getting out of, or whether you give a similar amount of space, but in a way that is much more transparent and much more encouraging to have this porosity and to engage with the intermediate spaces, the outside world. And I think it's very important to have all these different scale levels, that it's not private and public and nothing in between, that you have this kind of, communal spaces that are this gradient of private towards public. I think that's very important, and that's an architectural issue. So in that sense, I think the things that have been on the table today are very important, because they show different ways of organizing this contact between the private realm and the public realm and everything in between. So I would not go for the kind of option, well, okay, if people want to be individual, let them be individual.
I agree. I mean, but I'm not sure that the terms private and public are as useful as they have been at a particular time. I think those terms were introduced in the 70s in architecture speak, and they actually replaced a term which seems to me much more useful, at least at the present time, which previously people were talking about things being social, how social is a housing project. And already in this idea, you don't have this contrast between, on the one hand, the private and the public, and therefore that you can address the public, but you can't address the private, because the private is by definition private. I think one of the big issues, of course, is the seamlessness and of those two domains. Yeah. And there is also something that's very nice about the idea of the social, is that you can address the housing in the context of the whole society or the whole social development.
And I think it's important really to remember that this is a highly ideologized and political discussion we're leading. And if the city of New York and the mayor of New York decides to go for micro apartments for singles, this is kind of a normative decision which excludes the idea of creating similar structures for communes. And you could argue that if you have a large part of the population being singles, that you could foster buildings that could accommodate groups of 6. And I know it from some of my students who spend a summer with 6 people in a single bedroom apartment in Manhattan, which sounded exciting and chaotic to me. But there is clearly a demand, and a society that consists of single existence does not necessarily demand for single apartments. And providing single apartments, and again, I think that your project is a seminal and important project, but I wish you would have been demanded also, apart from what you did, to create communal buildings. Because I could imagine that all you said about the unit which is replaced by a dwelling form which is not separated into units could be a valuable thing to respond to the need to dwell together. And singles might live together, and this also relates to what you say. Of course, people are in a way insulated by their technology, but that could also mean that there could be a demand for communal forms, and if you foster this demand, then you could come up with new dwelling forms beyond the classic decision either to have a nuclear family apartment or an apartment for the single person. And I think this is far too few addressed, and it's a political decision to say we define a society of consisting of singles or families, and not to propose that people might live together by 4 or a circle of friends. And that's what we see in Berlin now, that people are responding to that by saying we try to self-empower us by buying some land and asking an architect to build something for us, and we pour money together, and then we have these communal projects. And this is a...
But this kind of projects, at least in Belgium, and I think it's similar elsewhere, are very often made very difficult because there is no legal format. For this kind of communal property. How do you construct the legal aspects of property. If you decide with a group of 40 people to buy land and to build a communal building like that, that's not easy.
No,
That's
in
quite
New York,
a challenge.
in New York, you're not allowed to live like that, right?
Well, I think you
Legally.
can create a cooperative. I mean, I bet it's true. We'd like to find a way to do what Spreefeld has done, in Brooklyn, for sure.
Yeah.
So, as you can see, our panelists have been so wonderful that I'm sure they've answered all the questions that the other people were going to ask. So I'm going to use my executive authority to thank them at this point and let you know that 3 of them, that is Irene, Nicholas, and Hilda, will actually be back at 10 a.m. in the library for those of you who are interested to continue this discussion. As you could also see, Nicholas has plenty of slides and a lot of other things that he would like to share with you. So come back then and let us continue the discussion in the morning that will go on from 10, hopefully until 11:30 in the morning if you can. I do want to thank all of you for being here. I really could sense some enthusiasm and energy in the room, and I think we're very lucky to have had these presentations. And of course, many thanks to also all of you who helped with the exhibition and the curators. I do like what Hilda tried to make sure that we kind of don't forget, which was really at the heart of this particular project and exhibition, which is for the school, especially at the beginning of the academic year, to place really significant resources and focus on the topic of housing. And this whole phenomenon of kind of reclaiming housing, in a way, is a key part of the project of the school, because it is true that for such a long time, the topic has been recognized as being very iconic, very symbolic, and something that we recognize as a significant part of the history of modernism. But I think it's also the time that we as a community, in a way, embrace and reclaim this particular topic. And I think the quality of the exhibition and the quality of the conversation in some way tonight is a very good beginning for us to, in a sense, embrace that particular project. So once again, thank you very much. I hope you enjoyed the reception and engage our panelists in further discussion. And come back tomorrow morning to the library at 10 o'clock for more images from Nicholas and more discussion. Thank you.